I want you to imagine yourself drifting into the stillness of night. The world outside your window is quiet, yet somewhere far beyond, the hum of restless voices and the ache of empty stomachs fill the air. You are safe here, listening, letting each word carry you deeper into the folds of history, into the memories of a man who lived through storms that most only read about. I was born into light, into privilege, into the kind of world where velvet curtains and polished silver set the rhythm of childhood. But privilege is no shield from fate. Even as I was carried through sunlit gardens, even as the world around me whispered of great expectations, a shadow was forming within me. Not the kind that strikes all at once, but one that creeps quietly, waiting until you least expect it. In those early years, the world seemed limitless. The air was filled with the scent of salt carried by the Hudson River, the sound of tutors correcting my Latin, the rustle of stiff collars and pressed suits. I was told that greatness was not an option for me. It was a duty. To be born into comfort was, in the eyes of my family, to be born into responsibility. Yet as I grew, I carried not just their expectations, but a quiet unease. Because destiny has a way of reminding us that we are human, fragile in ways no lineage can protect. There are moments in life when the body betrays the spirit. I still recall the summer evening when the strength in my legs dissolved like sand slipping through an open hand. At first it was a fever, the kind that mothers soothe with cool cloths and prayers. But then it became something deeper, something darker. My legs no longer answered my commands, and the man who once strode with certainty found himself staring at the floor, wondering if he would ever rise again. They told me I should accept my limits. They whispered in corridors when they thought I could not hear. Some said I had reached the end of what I could become, that I would vanish into quiet retirement, a name remembered only at dinner parties where fine wine softened the harshness of truth. Yet within me, another voice stirred. It was not loud, not defiant. It was steady, like a hand gripping a railing in the dark. I will not be finished. The nights after my illness were the hardest. Alone in a silent room, I would trace the patterns of the wallpaper, memorizing every curve because to lie still was to face despair. My body had become a prison. My mind grew sharper with every passing hour. Pain does not only take, it teaches. It strips away the illusions of comfort and forces you to see who you truly are when everything else is gone. But I would not let the world see my weakness. No, I learned to mask it, to smile when my legs refused me, to laugh when I burned with frustration. People believe strength is the absence of fear, but I tell you, true strength is the ability to keep walking when you know you cannot stand. And yet, I was not alone in this struggle. She stood by me, quiet at first, then stronger, finding her own voice as mine wavered. We had once been distant, almost like companions bound by duty more than passion. But suffering forges bonds that comfort cannot. She carried burdens I could not, spoke truths I dared not, and in her I found the mirror of resilience. Though our paths sometimes ran parallel rather than entwined, she became the anchor that steadied my drift. Even so, the world beyond our home was unraveling. In the streets, men stood in lines for bread that never came. Families huddled in cold apartments, their laughter stolen by the weight of unpaid bills and shuttered factories. They longed for someone, anyone, to tell them the storm would pass. And I wondered, could I be that voice even as I fought storms within my own skin? You see, power does not always announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it begins with a whisper, a single thought in the silence of night. Perhaps I can still serve, even broken as I am. Perhaps the world does not need a perfect man. It needs one who understands what it means to fall. But that wasn't the whole story, because behind every smile I gave, behind every carefully measured word, there was a secret battle. I learned to arrange chairs so no one would see me struggle. I planned my entrances so the illusion of strength remained intact. When the cameras flashed, they saw a man standing tall. What they didn't see was the weight of steel braces strapped beneath my trousers, the hidden strain of every step. It became a performance, a delicate dance between truth and illusion. And in time, I grew to understand something that would guide me for the rest of my life. People do not follow perfection. They follow hope. Hope does not require flawless bodies or unbroken spirits. It requires only the courage to face darkness and still speak of dawn. The whispers about me grew. Some doubted I would ever rise beyond the shadows of my illness. Others pitied me, writing me off as a man of wasted promise. But pity is a fire when you know how to use it. Every doubt became fuel. Every sneer became a reason to keep moving forward. In the quiet of my retreat, far from the halls of power, I made myself a promise. If I could no longer walk freely, I would learn to lead in ways that required no steps. And so, I began again. This was not the tale of a man untouched by weakness. It was the story of how weakness itself became the crucible of destiny. What came after, the battles, the speeches, the trials, was built on the foundation of those long nights when I learned the hardest truth: to endure is to conquer. But that was only the beginning, because just as I found my way back to purpose, the world itself was preparing to test me with trials greater than any fever or paralysis. And the man who had once been dismissed as broken would soon find himself called upon to heal a nation that was breaking too. I was raised in a world of polished wood and whispered expectations. From the moment I could speak, I was told I belonged to a family destined for more than ordinary life. Summers were spent on sprawling estates where the rivers caught the sunlight and the air smelled of cut grass and old books. Winters carried me into halls lined with portraits of stern men and regal women, each frame a silent reminder of the legacy I was meant to uphold. Yet, if you think this was freedom, you would be mistaken. Wealth can be as much a prison as poverty. It does not clatter with chains or barbed wire. It binds with silk and courtesy. I could not walk down a hallway without feeling the weight of eyes, the unspoken command that I must not falter, that I must represent something larger than myself. Even in laughter, I was being measured. The schools they sent me to were not places of warmth. They were training grounds for leaders, where boys were stripped of softness and molded into something resembling iron. At Groton, the cold New England air would bite at our cheeks as we marched in lines, our collars stiff, our manners stiffer. Discipline was preached as though it were salvation, and service to others was painted as the noblest path. I did not always agree, but I learned to listen, to absorb, to let those values seep into me until they became indistinguishable from my own. I was not the brightest boy in the room nor the most gifted, but I had a kind of quiet determination, the patience to outlast. Some laughed at my accent, my mannerisms, my way of speaking as though words themselves were measured coins. Yet words, I discovered, could shape impressions, and impressions were a currency as powerful as gold. When I moved on to Harvard, I believed I was stepping into freedom at last. The bustling squares of Cambridge, the endless libraries, the spirited debates, all of it fed a hunger inside me. For the first time, I was among young men who dreamed loudly, who argued over politics late into the night, who believed the world could be changed with the stroke of a pen. I watched, I listened, and slowly I began to speak, testing my voice in those crowded rooms. But there was something restless in me, something not satisfied by books and lectures alone. I wanted to stand where decisions were made, where voices carried not just across a classroom but across a nation. That desire frightened me at times, for I knew that ambition once kindled cannot easily be put out. It was during those years that she came into my life. At first, she seemed so different, quiet, serious, with a gaze that pierced through pretense. She did not fawn over wealth or privilege. Instead, she challenged me, sometimes with silence, sometimes with pointed questions that stripped away my easy charm. She became my companion, my confidant, and eventually, my wife. In her, I found both comfort and unease, for she did not always agree with me, did not always bend to my will. And yet, perhaps that was what I needed most. Someone who reminded me that greatness is not a solitary climb, but a shared burden. Together, We stepped into the social circles that demanded our presence. The banquets, the dances, the endless parade of introductions, all of it a stage where alliances were formed and broken with the raising of a glass. I learned to move through these rooms like a dancer, smiling at one moment, listening intently the next, never showing fatigue even when I felt the weight of it pressing down. Politics called to me like a distant drum. At first it was curiosity, the debates in Washington, the fierce arguments in newspapers, the stirring language of campaigns. But soon, curiosity turned into longing. I wanted to be part of that current, to place my hand on the wheel steering the course of events. I believed I could make a difference, though I did not yet understand the cost. My early steps into that world were small, almost hesitant. A speech here, a handshake there, the slow weaving of connections that might one day bear fruit. Yet each time I stood before a crowd, even a modest one, I felt something awaken. The rhythm of words, the rising swell of voices answering mine, it was intoxicating. I realized I could hold people, if only for a moment, if only with the promise of something brighter just beyond the horizon. Still, doubt followed me like a shadow. I wondered if I was too soft, too untested, too sheltered by the cocoon of privilege to truly lead. Others whispered the same, though not always to my face. Some said I lacked the fire, others that I relied too much on charm. Those whispers cut, but they also pushed me. I began to study not just books, but people, their fears, their hopes, the way their eyes lit up at the mention of security, or darkened at the thought of loss. It was a dangerous kind of education, one that taught me how malleable hearts could be, how easily trust could be won and lost. But it was also essential, for leadership is not forged in the glow of candles on fine tables. It is built in the silent exchange of belief between one person and another. Looking back now, I can see that my early years were not the story of freedom, but of preparation. Each lesson, each burden, each whispered doubt was carving me into someone I had not yet become. At the time, I thought I was simply living, moving through the stages set before me. In truth, I was being sharpened, tested in ways I could not yet recognize. But even as I moved forward, as I tasted the first hints of influence, the memory of my body's betrayal never left me. The legs that had once faltered remained weak, and though I hid it well, I knew that any path I chose would be walked with effort others could not see. I carried that secret into every room, every handshake, every promise, and still, the world beyond my circle was changing. Factories rose like giants, cities swelled with restless workers, and across the seas, unrest was brewing in nations that longed for dominance. I could not yet know how entangled my fate would become with theirs, but already the ground was shifting beneath us all. What happened next was not a gentle progression, it was a plunge. A moment when the life I had built would collide with forces determined to break it apart. Because destiny does not wait politely, it arrives uninvited, demanding more than you believe you have to give. The summer heat was heavy that year, the kind that clings to your skin and makes every breath feel weighted. I had been active, full of plans, proud of the progress I had begun to make. Politics was opening its doors to me. People were beginning to remember my name. I was still young enough to believe that life would bend to my will, that my path was secure. But fate has a way of striking when you are most certain of yourself. It began with a chill, a fever that seemed ordinary at first. I told myself it would pass. Men like me did not surrender to small discomforts. I had endured the exhaustion of campaigning, the endless banquets, the long hours of handshakes and speeches. A little fever could not undo me. Or so I thought. Then came the weakness. Subtle at first, like the body simply refusing its commands for a moment. But it grew. My legs trembled, then faltered. The ground beneath me no longer felt steady. I tried to rise, to shake it off as though sheer determination could restore me. But my body had decided otherwise. One morning, I awoke to find that I could not move as I once had. Panic set in, that hollow terror that fills you when the familiar suddenly betrays you. I was a man in the prime of his life, with ambitions stretching farther than I dared speak aloud, and yet I could not even command my own limbs. Doctors came and went, their faces grave, their words cautious. They spoke of polio. The word was like a death sentence whispered in the corners of the room. Some said I would recover, others that I would never walk again. But in those early days, all I knew was pain, the ache of muscles refusing, the humiliation of helplessness. I remember lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled conversations outside my door, my children's laughter, hushed quickly when they remembered I could hear. My wife's steady voice firm even when I knew her heart was breaking. Friends who visited wore smiles stretched too thin, their eyes betraying the pity they tried to conceal. Pity is a cruel thing. It smothers hope while pretending to offer comfort. There were moments I thought of surrender. What good was a man who could not even stand? I imagined slipping away quietly, fading from public life, retreating into a private world where no one would see my weakness. Many thought that was exactly what I would do. They expected me to vanish, to become a ghost of potential unfulfilled, but as I lay there night after night, something else began to take shape inside me. A kind of defiance, not loud, not reckless, but stubborn, unyielding. I would not let my life end in that bed. If I could not walk as I once had, then I would learn to move differently. If I could not climb with legs, then I would climb with will. It was in those dark months that I discovered the true measure of resilience. I trained myself to smile when despair clawed at me. I learned how to mask pain behind ease, how to disguise weakness beneath charm. Every photograph, every public appearance became a performance. I arranged rooms so no one saw the braces that bound my legs. I practiced standing with assistance until I could make it seem effortless. But it was not effortless. Every step was a battle, every appearance a risk that someone might glimpse the truth. I lived in fear of exposure, and yet I also lived in determination that no one would see me as broken. There was one place, though, where the mask could slip: Warm Springs, Georgia. The water there held a kind of magic, or at least it felt that way to me. When I submerged myself, when the buoyancy lifted my body, I felt almost whole again. The pain eased, the struggle lessened. It was not a cure, but it was relief. And in that relief I found a new mission. Warm Springs became more than my refuge. It became a place where I could look into the eyes of others, stricken by the same cruel illness, and see myself reflected. Children who had lost the use of their limbs, men and women who carried the same despair I had known. With them, I was not a politician, not a figure of privilege. I was simply another soul, learning how to endure. There is a lesson in suffering shared. It binds people faster than laughter ever could. In Warm Springs, I learned humility. I learned that leadership is not only about commanding, it is about listening, about understanding pain and transforming it into action. The world beyond, however, was less forgiving. Rumors swirled. Some said I was finished, that no man in my condition could rise to prominence. Whispers followed me into every room. Could a man who could not stand unaided stand for a nation? Could a body bound in braces carry the weight of power? I answered those whispers not with argument, but with presence. I appeared where they did not expect me. I spoke with confidence when they thought I should be silent. I smiled when they looked for pity. Slowly, steadily, I began to reshape perception. They no longer saw a crippled man. They saw a figure who, against all odds, refused to fall. But let me tell you the truth they did not see. Each night when the lights dimmed and the crowd was gone, I collapsed into exhaustion. My legs throbbed with the strain of holding the illusion. My spirit ached with the weight of pretense. It was not easy, and it was not painless, but it was necessary. Because I understood something many did not. People do not need to see perfection. They need to see strength. They need to believe that no matter the hardship, someone can endure it and still move forward. My wife became my greatest ally in this deception and this truth. She carried messages when I could not travel. She stood in for me when fatigue consumed me. And in doing so, she found her own voice, strong, independent, relentless. Our partnership was not always simple, not always gentle, but it was forged in the crucible of necessity. Without her, I might have remained hidden. With her, I began to rise again. Still, the memory of that first collapse never left me. It whispered in my bones, a reminder that every victory was fragile. I carried it like a scar beneath my clothes, unseen by the world but always present. And so when opportunities began to return, when political doors creaked open once more, I stepped through them, not as the man I had once been, but as something harder, sharper. I had known despair, and I had refused to let it consume me. That refusal became my strength, my armor, my quiet weapon. Those who had dismissed me as finished would soon learn their mistake. But that wasn't the whole story. For while my body had been reshaped by illness, my ambition had been reshaped as well. I no longer sought power simply because it was expected. I sought it because I had tasted helplessness, and I knew that millions in my country lived with the same despair. Despair not of illness, but of poverty, of hunger, of uncertainty. My suffering had given me a window into theirs, and I promised myself, if ever I were given the chance, I would speak not just for the strong, but for those who felt abandoned, broken, forgotten. I did not yet know how soon that chance would come. When you have fallen once, truly fallen, you do not rise the same. You rise with scars beneath your skin, with the memory of the ground still clinging to you. That memory becomes both a burden and a gift. It teaches you that nothing is guaranteed, that every step is borrowed, and that endurance is the only true currency a person has. I carried that lesson with me as I re-entered public life. Many thought I would never return, that I would remain a man who once showed promise, only to be silenced by the cruel hand of fate. But whispers of my recovery, of my determination, had begun to spread. And when the opportunity came to re-enter politics, I seized it not with the reckless certainty of youth, but with the steel of one who had learned to live with weakness. The journey was not smooth. At every turn, I faced questions whispered in corners. Could he endure the strain? Could he campaign? Could he govern? Could he truly lead? The doubters were legion, but I had already faced the darkest doubts in my own heart. Compared to those nights of despair, their skepticism was nothing. So I stood once again before the people, this time as a candidate for governor of New York. I spoke not with the polished detachment of privilege, but with the conviction of someone who knew suffering. I had seen the broken, the abandoned, the forgotten, and I carried their voices with mine. To the surprise of many, I won. Governing New York was no gentle apprenticeship. The state was reeling from poverty, unemployment, and political corruption. It demanded energy, vision, and resolve. I poured myself into the task. Reforms were pushed through, corruption challenged, relief programs expanded. I was not simply holding office, I was learning how to wield it. Eleanor too began to transform. She had once been shy, hesitant, overshadowed by me and by the expectations of society. But during my illness, she had been forced to step forward, to speak where I could not, to organize, to lead. That fire did not dim when I returned to politics. She became my partner not just in marriage but in purpose. She visited factories, schools, and prisons, bringing back to me the voices of those I could not always reach. She became my eyes and ears, my conscience, my reminder that leadership was not about glory, but about service. Together we forged something new. I began to realize that politics was not merely a path to power, it was a duty to the people who had no voice. And yet, even as I threw myself into this work, I could never quite escape the shadow of my condition. Every step into a room, every appearance before a crowd, was a carefully orchestrated performance. My braces, my crutches, the assistance I required, all of it hidden from view. The public saw a man standing tall, smiling, confident. Only a few knew the effort it took to maintain that illusion. Still, I pressed forward. For in pressing forward, I discovered something unexpected. The people did not care for perfection, they cared for hope. And if I could give them that, if I could make them believe that even the darkest storm could be endured, then my struggle was worth every ounce of pain. It was during these years, as the nation itself began to stagger under the weight of the Great Depression, that my destiny came into focus. I had watched the markets crash, watched the panic spread, watched men lose everything they had built in a single day. Bread lines stretched for blocks, factories shut their gates, families packed their belongings onto wagons and drifted in search of work. America was breaking. And I knew, in the depths of my being, that this was the moment I had been prepared for, not by privilege, not by education, but by suffering. For I understood despair and I knew what it meant to fight through it. When the call came to stand as a candidate for the presidency, some said it was folly. They said the nation needed a man of iron, a man untarnished, a man who could embody strength without question. What they did not understand was that my very weakness had become my strength. I was not untarnished, I was not unbroken, and that was precisely why I could lead. The campaign was grueling, yet exhilarating. I traveled, I spoke, I reached out to people in every corner of the country. In my voice, they heard not the aloofness of privilege, but the echo of their own struggles. I promised them a new deal, not just a program, but a new beginning, a chance to believe again in the promise of America. I remember the night of victory. The crowds gathered, the cheers rose into the sky, the weight of expectation settled upon me like a mantle. In that moment, I thought of the boy I had been, walking the halls of privilege, uncertain and restless. I thought of the man lying helpless in bed, legs useless, spirit broken. And I thought of the path that had carried me here, to this moment where history itself bent to my presence. It was then, and only then, that I allowed myself to speak the truth plainly without disguise, without hesitation. I am Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the people had chosen me to lead them from despair into hope. But victory was not the end. It was only the beginning. The nation I inherited was not merely wounded, it was bleeding. Banks were failing, families starving, farmers ruined, factories silent. People did not trust institutions, did not trust leaders, did not even trust the future. They needed more than policy. They needed reassurance. They needed someone to speak to them as though they mattered, to remind them that even in darkness they were not alone. So I spoke to them, not from the lofty perch of government, but from the intimacy of a fireside. Through the crackling of radios, my voice entered their homes, their kitchens, their parlors. I spoke calmly, plainly, as though to a friend. And they listened. In those words, they found something they had thought lost: comfort. But what I gave them was not comfort alone. I gave them resolve. I told them that together we could rebuild, that together we could endure. And as I spoke, I felt the weight of my own hidden braces, the secret pain of every step. And I thought, if I can endure, then so can they. Yet even as I poured myself into these efforts, shadows lengthened across the ocean. In Europe, a man with a raised fist was rallying crowds into frenzy. In Asia, a rising empire was hungering for conquest. Storms were gathering, storms that would test not just me, not just America, but the entire world. And as I looked ahead, I knew that my true trial had not yet begun, because to lead a broken nation through hardship is one thing. To lead it through the fires of global war, that would demand everything I had left to give. The day I placed my hand upon the Bible and swore the oath of office, the air was heavy with fear. Not the fear of war, not yet, but the quieter, more insidious terror of hunger and despair. America was not simply wounded, it was paralyzed. Banks had shuttered their doors, leaving people with nothing but scraps of paper in place of savings. Farmers saw their land stripped away, their crops rotting in the fields. Factories stood silent, their machines still, their workers dismissed. As I looked out across the crowd gathered for my inauguration, their faces told me everything. Worn, pale, tense, people had come not for ceremony but for reassurance. They wanted to know if this nation still had a future. I remember the words I spoke that day. words that would be repeated, remembered, dissected. Yet for me, they were not mere rhetoric. They were the truth I needed to hear myself, that the only thing we had to fear was fear itself, for fear had become our greatest enemy, spreading faster than hunger, more destructive than drought. Those words carried me into my first 100 days in office, a period that would test not only my resolve, but the very idea of democracy itself. Nations elsewhere were turning to dictators, to iron fists promising quick solutions. People whispered that democracy was too slow, too weak to face such crisis, but I refused to believe it. I wanted to prove that a free people, united in common cause, could rise stronger than ever. I acted quickly, decisively. The banks were collapsing like dominoes, each failure feeding panic. So I declared a banking holiday, a pause, a chance to stop the bleeding. Critics called it reckless, unprecedented, but when the banks reopened days later and deposits began to flow back instead of out, the people realized that confidence had returned. It was not policy alone that saved them. It was belief that someone was steering the ship again. From there, the floodgates opened. Legislation rolled out with a speed that startled even seasoned lawmakers. Relief for the unemployed, aid for farmers, regulations to tame the chaos of Wall Street. Agencies sprang up with names that became part of everyday conversation. The CCC, the WPA, the TVA, programs that put men to work building roads, planting trees, bringing electricity to rural homes where kerosene lamps had long been the only light. Each act was a stone laid in the foundation of recovery, and yet I knew recovery was not only about work or wages, it was about spirit. The Depression had not only emptied wallets, it had hollowed out hearts. People needed to feel they mattered, that their suffering was seen. So I spoke to them, directly, not through speeches written for grand halls, but through radios glowing softly in kitchens and living rooms. I called them fireside chats, though there was no fire beside me as I spoke. Only a microphone, a script, and the image in my mind of ordinary families listening, leaning closer to catch each word. I explained complex policies in simple terms. I told them what we had done, what we were doing, what we must yet face together, and the letters poured in by the thousands. People wrote to tell me they felt, perhaps for the first time, that their president was speaking to them, not at them. In their words, I found my strength renewed. But these victories were not without controversy. There were those who whispered that I was overstepping, that the power I wielded was too great. Some called me a dictator in all but name. They pointed to the alphabet soup of agencies, to the sweeping reach of government into the lives of ordinary citizens, and they warned of tyranny. I heard their words, I noted their criticisms, but I did not yield, because I knew what they did not, that democracy, left to stagnate, would crumble, that without bold action, desperation would drive people to embrace dangerous extremes. My policies were not born of hunger for power, but of necessity. Still, I will not deny there was satisfaction in silencing those who doubted me, in proving them wrong. Even as we rebuilt, cracks remained. Unemployment persisted. Poverty lingered in corners untouched by reform. And beyond the oceans, dark clouds gathered. In Germany, a man named Hitler was rising, his voice swelling with venom, his promises intoxicating. In Italy, Mussolini marched with arrogance. In Japan, militarists sharpened their ambitions. I watched, listened, and wondered how long the Atlantic and Pacific could shield us from the storms brewing abroad. But I did not speak of that, not yet. My duty was first to heal my own nation, to show my people that hope was not a memory, but a living force. And in time, that hope began to take root. Children returned to schools with food in their bellies. Farmers began to believe in their land again. Men and women who had nearly given up found themselves working once more, building bridges, dams, parks, monuments not of stone alone, but of resilience. There were nights, though, when I sat alone in the White House, the glow of the lamps casting long shadows on the walls, and I felt the weight of it all pressing on me. My body still betrayed me, my legs still bound by steel and willpower. The effort of standing, of appearing strong, grew heavier with each passing year, yet I could never let them see. The nation needed a figure who seemed unbreakable. So I became that figure, even as I paid the price in private. I often wondered then, and still do now, did they know? Did the people see the truth behind the illusion? Or did they believe entirely in the image I crafted? Perhaps it did not matter. What mattered was that they believed in themselves again. But that wasn't the whole story. Because even as I poured myself into saving America from its economic abyss, I knew another trial was coming, one that would dwarf the Depression in scale and terror. The world beyond was not content to remain in chaos. It was moving towards something far darker, and sooner or later, that darkness would reach our shores. And when it did, I would need to summon more than policies and programs. I would need to summon every ounce of resilience I had ever forged, every lesson learned in suffering, every mask of strength I had ever worn. For the battle ahead would not be about saving banks or farms. It would be about saving civilization itself. The years that followed were years of uneasy calm, though calm was not the word many would use. At home, we continued the slow climb out of despair. There was work to be done in every town, every factory, every field, and though progress was steady, it was fragile. Each day brought letters to my desk, pleas from farmers who could not pay their debts, from workers desperate for a job, from mothers who feared their children would not eat. I read them late into the night, sometimes until my eyes blurred, because they reminded me of what we were fighting for. Yet as I read, I could not ignore the growing sense that America's troubles were not contained within our own borders. Beyond the oceans, something dangerous was stirring. I first sensed it in the reports that arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, tucked into the piles of routine briefings. They spoke of a man in Germany whose voice could rouse crowds into frenzy, who spoke of purity and destiny while scapegoating the vulnerable. They described parades of soldiers marching in lockstep, flags bearing a symbol that grew more sinister each time it was unfurled. At first it seemed distant, a storm on another continent. But I had lived long enough to know that storms do not respect boundaries. Italy, too, boasted of its strength under a leader who adored the pomp of uniforms and spectacle. Across the Pacific, Japan's ambitions sharpened into steel. Reports of invasions, of cruelty in places most Americans could not even locate on a map, crossed my desk with increasing frequency. These were not isolated events. They were threads of a tapestry being woven, a tapestry of aggression and domination. Here at home, many clung fiercely to the idea that America should remain apart from these troubles. The memories of the last war still lingered, a generation scarred by mud, gas, and graves across Europe. Isolation was not simply a policy, it was a conviction, a demand from citizens who wanted no part of foreign entanglements. I understood them. I too carried the weight of the fallen, yet I also understood that pretending the world's problems could never touch us was a dangerous illusion. I began to act quietly, carefully, as though stepping across thin ice. To speak too boldly of involvement would have provoked outrage, perhaps rebellion. But to do nothing was unthinkable. I crafted programs that seemed modest on the surface, yet carried great consequence. We called it Lend-Lease, a way of aiding those who fought against tyranny without sending our sons directly into battle. Critics called it a backdoor to war, an invitation to disaster. They accused me of dragging America where it did not wish to go. Their voices were loud, insistent, and at times venomous. I listened, but I did not yield. I had seen enough to know that evil left unchecked grows bold. I had no illusions about the men who rose in Europe and Asia. Their ambitions were not small, not limited. They wanted more than territory. They wanted dominion. And I believed with every fiber of my being that if they succeeded, the world we knew would vanish. There were nights I lay awake in the White House, the windows open to the restless city beyond, and I wondered how long we could hold to this fragile balance. I knew the people were weary of sacrifice. I knew they wanted peace, Yet I also knew that peace in a world dominated by violence is only the pause before surrender. It was a tormenting knowledge, one I could not fully share, not yet. Still, hints of what was coming pressed into daily life. We began to build ships, planes, weapons, not in the open fury of war, but in preparation. Factories that had stood idle roared to life, their smokestacks filling the skies. Men and women found themselves called to work again, not for relief this time, but for production. It gave them pride, a sense of purpose, though many did not yet grasp the reason for such urgency. I spoke often of the four freedoms, the ideals I believed should guide not only America, but the entire world. Freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. They were simple words, yet they cut to the heart of what was at stake. If the forces rising abroad prevailed, these freedoms would wither, not just for distant peoples, but eventually for us as well. Some understood, others dismissed it as lofty rhetoric. But I knew these freedoms were not abstractions. They were the bedrock of human dignity. Opposition hardened at home. The America First movement gathered strength, insisting that our shores could be defended without entangling alliances. They argued that the oceans were our walls, that Europe's fate need not be ours. Some even admired the efficiency of dictators, their apparent strength compared to the messy debates of democracy. It chilled me to hear such voices, to realize that the poison of authoritarianism could seep even into our own land. And then came that Sunday morning, a day that began with quiet, with church bells and families at rest, a day that should have been unremarkable, until the radios crackled with news that flames had consumed the skies over Hawaii. Ships burned, sailors leapt into oil-slicked waters, the Pacific itself turned red with fire. Pearl Harbor had been struck, and in a single moment, the illusion of distance was shattered. I remember sitting with the telegrams, the reports rushing in, the disbelief turning to cold certainty. Japan had attacked, and thousands were dead. America was no longer a bystander. The storm we had tried to keep at bay had reached our shores. The following day I spoke to Congress and through them to the nation. My voice, calm but firm, carried words that would echo through history, a date which will live in infamy. I asked for war, not with hesitation, not with apology, but with the clarity of one who knew there was no other path left. And Congress answered with near unanimity. The die was cast. The people, once so adamant about staying out of foreign conflicts, now rallied with a unity that astonished even me. Enlistment lines formed overnight. Factories turned to armories, assembly lines into engines of war. The nation that had been fractured by depression now stood together, united in a common cause. It was a transformation as swift as it was profound. Yet even in that moment of resolve, I felt the weight of what was to come. War is not glory, it is sacrifice, and sacrifice measured in lives. Every decision I made from that day forward would cost someone their son, their husband, their brother. The thought haunted me, but I could not allow it to paralyze me. Leadership demanded resolve, and so I steeled myself for the burden. From that moment, my life was no longer divided between private and public. Everything became the war. Every waking hour was devoted to strategy, to alliances, to production. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, it was filled with dreams of battlefields I would never see yet felt as if I had walked them myself. I met with Churchill, with generals, with admirals. We spoke in hushed tones of plans that would alter the fate of continents. The Atlantic Charter was drawn, promises made for a world beyond victory. But victory was distant, uncertain, costly. And though I presented confidence to the nation, inside I wrestled with doubt. Could we truly withstand what was coming? Could we bear the weight of global war while still healing from our own wounds? But what choice was there? To hesitate would be to lose everything. And so I pressed forward with conviction, with resolve, with the quiet knowledge that the hardest days still lay ahead. The oceans were no longer barriers, they were battlegrounds, and the world looked to me, to America, not just for weapons or ships, but for hope itself. The day the nation declared war, everything shifted. The streets that once echoed with the weariness of the Depression now pulsed with a new kind of energy. Factories roared with the clang of steel and the hiss of welders, their machines running day and night. Farmers pushed their fields to yield more. Women rolled up their sleeves and stepped into roles once denied them, and young men marched off with uniforms still stiff from the tailor, their faces alight with pride and fear. America had become an arsenal, and I stood at its helm. I spoke to the people often, not with lofty speeches, but with steady words. They needed to hear not just strategies and statistics, but reassurance that they were not sacrificing in vain. I told them we were part of something larger, that our fight was not for conquest, but for survival, for freedom itself. And they believed me, not because my words were flawless, but because they sensed I believed them too. The war consumed everything. Each day brought reports of battles fought on islands most Americans could not name, in deserts and jungles and seas where blood mingled with the tide. I carried the weight of those reports in silence. Each number was a life, each life a family left behind. When I visited the wounded, when I saw the faces of those who had given pieces of themselves for this cause, my resolve deepened, but so too did the ache inside me. Across the Atlantic, I forged an alliance with Winston Churchill. We could not have been more different, he with his bulldog defiance, I with my quiet determination. Yet together we became twin pillars, holding aloft a crumbling world. We met in war rooms thick with smoke, in hidden conferences where maps sprawled across tables dotted with pins that marked life and death. He drank heavily, spoke loudly, filled the air with bravado. I listened, considered, measured my words. Between us, strategy was born, not of ego but of necessity. Then there was Stalin, a man colder than the Russian winter itself. With him, alliances were fragile things, built not on trust, but on mutual need. We shook hands, knowing that neither fully trusted the other. Yet the enemy we faced demanded cooperation. I stared into his eyes and saw no warmth, only calculation, but I knew we could not prevail without his armies bleeding on the Eastern Front. At home, unity was both a triumph and a burden. Factories that had once sat silent were now engines of victory. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol, but behind her poster smile were millions of women balancing work and home, filling the shoes of men who fought abroad. African-American soldiers demanded equality even as they trained in segregated units. Japanese-American families torn from their homes were forced into camps by the stroke of my pen. It is one of the decisions that still haunts me. I told myself it was necessary, that in times of war, caution must be harsh. Yet I knew even then that it carried an injustice that history would not forgive. I aged quickly in those years. My body, already weakened, grew more fragile. The braces felt heavier, the effort to appear strong more draining. But I would not let the nation see weakness. They needed to believe their leader was as unyielding as the cause itself. So I smiled through the pain, stood when I could, masked the tremor in my hands. Leadership is as much performance as it is policy, and I had perfected the art of seeming whole even when I was breaking. Each victory was a relief, each loss a personal wound. When our troops stormed North Africa, when the beaches of Italy fell, when the long struggle in the Pacific inched forward, I felt the tide slowly turning. Yet even then, the cost was staggering. Letters poured in from mothers and wives, their grief etched into every line. I read them at night, alone, their words sinking into me like stones. I could not answer them all, but I carried their sorrow with me into every decision. There were moments of hope, too. The sight of factories producing ships faster than the enemy could sink them, of young men marching with determination, of nations once divided now bound in common purpose. These glimpses sustained me, kept me moving forward, for I knew the path was long and the end not yet in sight. But even as the war raged abroad, I knew another battle was being fought at home. The battle for spirit. Rationing tested patience, Blackouts unsettled cities. Families went years without seeing their sons. I had to remind them over and over why they endured, not with false promises of easy victory, but with the assurance that their sacrifices would mean something lasting. I will not deny there were times I faltered in private, times I questioned whether we could truly withstand the enemy's fury, whether the oceans we once thought protected us would now drown us. But each time despair crept near, I thought of those boys in uniform, of their mothers' letters, of the workers in factories straining through exhaustion. If they could endure, then so must I. As the tide began to shift, as the Allies pushed forward, I knew the hardest trials still lay ahead. Victory was no longer a dream, but it was still distant, and the closer it came, the higher the cost would rise. And I carried the knowledge, whispered in the quiet of sleepless nights, that I might not live to see the peace I sought. But that wasn't the whole story. For even as the guns thundered overseas, even as the world reshaped itself in fire and blood, I was already thinking of what must come after. I believed that this war, this terrible crucible, could not end as the last one had, with bitterness and fractured peace. If it did, then all this sacrifice would be for nothing. And so, even as I guided my nation through battle, I began to dream of what the world could be when the guns finally fell silent. A world not of empires and conquest, but of cooperation, of freedom, of unity. Whether I would live to see it, I did not yet know, but I knew I must plant its seeds while I still had the strength to stand. The war pressed on, and so did I, though my body betrayed me more with each passing year. The strain was immense, the hours unrelenting. Meetings that stretched through the night, maps littered with pins marking beaches, forests and cities where men would live or die by the decisions made in those rooms. I leaned heavily on my aides, on Eleanor, on the small circle of advisors who understood the toll it took. To the world, I presented strength. To myself, I admitted only in silence that I was fading. I concealed it carefully. The nation could not see a faltering leader, not while their sons stormed beaches and their daughters kept the factories alive. I arranged my schedule so fatigue was hidden, orchestrated appearances so no one would glimpse the tremor in my hands or the deep shadows under my eyes. The braces on my legs were heavier than ever, the act of standing itself a negotiation between pride and pain. Yet when the cameras flashed, when the microphones clicked on, I smiled, lifted my chin and gave them the image of unbroken resolve. But the truth was harsher. My heart labored under the strain. The doctors knew it, and I knew it, though we spoke of it in whispers, if at all. There were moments I felt the weight in my chest like a stone, moments when simply breathing seemed an effort. Yet there was no time to rest, no luxury to withdraw. The world was at war, and I could not falter without consequence. The decisions I made were not all noble. Some were compromises born of desperation. The internment camps still haunted me, thousands of loyal citizens uprooted, their lives shattered by fear masquerading as security. I signed the order knowing it was a violation, telling myself it was necessary, yet never fully believing the excuse. History would judge me for it, and rightly so. Even as we fought abroad, at home, voices rose demanding change. African-American soldiers returned from the front, demanding the same freedoms they had defended overseas. Workers demanded fair treatment. Women demanded recognition for their labor. I welcomed these voices, yet I also knew I could not give them all they sought. Not yet. War demanded unity, and unity demanded sacrifice. It was a cruel paradox. To preserve freedom, I asked many to live without it. Eleanor became my conscience in those days. She traveled where I could not, spoke to those I had overlooked. She visited miners, soldiers, prisoners, the poor, and she brought their voices back to me. At times we quarreled. She pushed harder than I wished, spoke truths that unsettled me. But I knew she was right. She saw the world not from the heights of office, but from the ground where ordinary people lived. She reminded me that leadership was not about appearances, but about compassion. even when compassion was inconvenient. Rumors swirled, of course. They whispered about my health, about whether I would survive the war. Opponents speculated, newspapers probed, yet the full truth never emerged. I made sure of that. To admit weakness would have been to admit vulnerability not only to our enemies, but to our allies, who relied on my presence as a constant in the storm. And so I endured in silence, showing them only what they needed to see. By the time the election came again, many questioned whether I could serve another term. I questioned it myself. The toll was visible to those who looked closely. My face had aged beyond its years. My body felt like a machine held together by willpower alone. And yet, when the people called for me again, I could not refuse. To abandon the post in the midst of war felt like betrayal. So I stood once more for office, and once more they placed their trust in me. It was both a victory and a sentence. For with the fourth term came responsibilities heavier than any before. The war was entering its final, brutal stages. Battles raged in Europe, in the Pacific, in skies and seas across the globe. The end was near, but the end was often the bloodiest part. I knew the decisions I would make in those final months would shape not only the outcome of the war, but the world that followed. Late at night, when the war rooms were empty, I sat alone with the maps spread before me. I traced the lines of rivers and coastlines with my finger, wondering how many lives each decision would claim. I thought of the letters I had read from grieving mothers, from soldiers writing their last words before battle. I thought of the children who would inherit the world we were fighting to preserve. And I asked myself again and again whether I would live long enough to see it through. The answer, though I never spoke it aloud, was no. I felt it deep inside, the slow ebbing of strength, the relentless march of my own decline. My time was running out, yet I could not allow anyone to see. So I pressed forward, smiling through the pain, promising victory, even as I doubted whether I would be there to witness it. And still, I believed that if I gave all I had, if I held fast until the last breath, the nation would endure. That belief sustained me, even as my body betrayed me more each day. But that wasn't the whole story, for in the silence of those long nights, I dreamed not of victory parades or glory, but of peace. A peace stronger than the one that had failed after the last war. A peace built not on vengeance, but on cooperation. I dreamed of an organization that could unite nations, that could give humanity a forum to resolve disputes before they turned to war. It was a dream fragile and ambitious, but I believed it was the only hope for a world that had seen too much blood. And so, even as the war raged, even as my heart labored, I began laying the foundation for that dream. I spoke of it to Churchill, to Stalin, to the leaders of nations battered and weary. Some scoffed, some doubted, but I pressed on, because I knew more surely than anything else that my time was short. If I could not live to see peace, I would at least leave behind its blueprint. The world believed me strong. In truth, I was already fading, but I had one last task before me, to ensure that when I was gone, hope would not vanish with me. The fourth time the people entrusted me with the nation's destiny, the weight settled upon me like a winter cloak, heavy, inevitable, impossible to shrug free. I had won again, not because I desired power for its own sake, but because in the turbulence of war, familiarity felt like safety to many. They wanted a steady hand, someone who had navigated storms before and whose voice could soothe the panic that still rose from time to time. I tried to be that hand. I tried to be that voice. But the truth, as I felt it in the marrow of my bones, was that each term had carved deeper into me. The braces beneath my trousers had been joined by an ache in my chest that did not relent. I kept moving, because moving was what we did. Plans to make, convoys to reroute, alliances to mend. The maps in the war rooms became not simply tools, but companions, their lines and pins familiar as the wrinkles on an old friend's face. I traced them often, thinking of the men who would obey the pins on those maps, who would march where I could only imagine. In the midst of cannon and strategy, my thoughts drifted to the future I wanted to leave behind. Victory was a destination, but what came after was the real test. Would the peace we won be lasting, or would it crumble into the same bitterness that followed the last Great War? I believed the only way to prevent recurrence was to build institutions that bound nations together, that made cooperation easier than conflict. I spoke often of a council of nations, of rules and forums where grievances could be aired instead of bullets. The idea seemed almost audacious in its hope, but hope had always been my refuge. Conferences were arranged. Men traveled across oceans under secrecy and caution, meeting in rooms where cigars burned and maps were unrolled with trembling fingers. I sat with Churchill and Stalin, and with leaders whose faces the world would come to know intimately. We argued, bargained, and sometimes found common ground. There were nights when compromise felt like betrayal, and days when unity felt like salvation. Trust was a scarce commodity, hoarded and measured, yet we managed to piece together agreements that began to sketch the outlines of a new world order. At Yalta, the air smelled of tobacco, and the frost from the Russian steppe seeped into the bones of the place. We negotiated long into the night, sometimes raising voices, sometimes falling into heavy silence. I knew Stalin had his own designs, and I did not pretend otherwise. But I believed that if we could secure a framework for cooperation, if we could ensure the defeat of tyranny, and then build institutions to prevent its return, then the compromises, however bitter, might be justified by the greater good. I left those halls weary, but convinced that we had planted seeds that might one day bear the fruit of lasting peace. Yet even as we spoke of peace, the war's demands did not relent. The push into Europe, the island hopping across the Pacific, the relentless grind of victory that cost so much, each step forward was paid for in blood. I read the casualty lists until the names blurred into one another, each line an echo of a home that would never be the same. I could not erase that truth, and none of my speeches could soften the sting of a mother's grief. I carried those names with me into every meeting, into every decision, as if each one were a weight that might anchor me against the tide of exhaustion. My time in the White House became a blur of schedules and decisions. I attended briefings where generals explained plans in tones both precise and grim. I approved strategies that would lead to liberation and to loss in equal measure. Sometimes I wondered if the burdens I placed upon myself were worth the cost, and yet I knew surrender was not an option. To yield would have condemned millions to further suffering. So I pressed on, asking of myself what I would not ask of others: relentless focus, an endurance that sometimes ignored the body's cries for rest. In private, the pain grew sharper. Nights were rarely true rest. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by telegrams, nightmares, the weight of future choices. I found myself retreating, more often, to the quiet places where memory lived. Warm springs called to me sometimes like a distant shore, its waters offering a temporary reprieve from the friction of steel and speeches. There I could feel buoyant, if only for a moment, as the water lifted my limbs and eased the immediate sting of pain. It was a small mercy, a borrowed hour of peace in a life otherwise spent chasing the horizon. Eleanor's presence, as always, steadied me. Her public profile had become expansive, her voice commanding rooms I could not always enter. She had discovered an authority separate from mine, and it both comforted and unsettled me. We argued, we reconciled, and through it all, her activism, her insistence upon fairness, her compassion for the marginalized, shaped the policies and conscience of our administration. She reminded me, often with a firmness that could pierce the room, that victory must be married to justice if it was to last. But power courts contradiction. In decisions weighed for the state, I sometimes set aside the human cost in ways that time would judge harshly. Internment, the delay in confronting racial injustice, compromises made for military expediency. These are stains I know will never erase themselves. In the quiet of late nights, I wrestled with them, rationalized them, and sometimes could not find solace. Leadership demands choices, and choices always leave casualties in their wake. I took that burden personally, and it aged me faster than any illness. Even as the war wound toward its conclusion, my body betrayed me in ways that could no longer be completely hidden. The faces of friends and aides grew more concerned. The doctor's counsel moved from worry to alarm. My speeches required greater effort. The pauses grew longer, and my voice sometimes faltered where it had once been steady as a bell. Yet I continued, because there were meetings that could not be missed, decisions that could not be deferred, and a world that still looked to America for direction. The autumn of my final months brought moments I remember with an odd clarity. The crispness of the air on a walk, the distant sound of applause in a hall where some victory was being celebrated, the letters from soldiers' families thanking me for something I had only enabled. There was pride, yes, but also a looming sense that my work was incomplete. I wanted to see the first steps of the institutions I had imagined, the meetings where diplomats gathered not to plot war, but to resolve disputes. I wanted to see the day when returning soldiers would find a nation that remembered them with more than gratitude, with action that secured their futures. One afternoon in a modest room, away from the pomp, I felt a heaviness descend that I had never felt before. It was not sudden like a broken bone, but more like a tide pulling inward, a fatigue that dug deep into the heart. I dismissed it at first, attributing it to stress, to lack of sleep. But the pain did not pass. It pressed on me, quiet and relentless, until I could no longer deny its presence. I called for a doctor, and the world narrowed to the faces around me, the hushed tones, the soft commands. When it became clear that I would not recover from this particular wound, my thoughts went not to regret, but to the framework I had labored to build. I thought of the charter we had sketched, the seeds of an assembly that might one day convene for the good of humanity. I thought of Eleanor, of how she would carry forward what I could not finish, and of the many men and women who had believed enough to follow. It comforted me more than I expected, this knowledge that my work was not mine alone, that I had placed it in hands ready to continue. I remember the last hours with a clarity that does not belong to ordinary recollection. The rooms felt both vast and confining. Voices were muffled as through water. I held on to thoughts of peace, of a world where children would not grow up fearing the night. I thought of small things too, the sound of my grandchildren's laughter in a garden, the warmth of sunlight on my face, the steady, stubborn love of a woman who had been beside me through the brightest and bleakest days. Then came the silence that no leader can command. My breath slowed, my grip loosened, and I felt, in a way both terrifying and oddly gentle, the thread between my life and whatever lay beyond begin to thin. It was not dramatic. There were no grand declarations in that final moment, only the soft exhalation of a man who had given everything he knew to give. When the hand went still, the nation felt it as if a pillar had fallen. The mourning was immense and raw, streets lined in solemnity, bells tolling, a people who had rode the waves of despair and hope now grappling with the absence of the man who had steered them through both. Eleanor's grief was not only personal but public, her mantle now heavy with the task of carrying forward a legacy that would be both lauded and interrogated. They would call me many things in the years to come: savior, architect of recovery, wartime leader, flawed statesman. They would study my deeds, celebrate my speeches, and condemn my errors. History would be both kind and cruel. I accepted that. What I hoped in those last breaths was that the institutions we had begun to build would stand long enough to keep the peace we had fought for, that the children of this battered world might one day know a life less crowded by fear. And so my story passed from the living into memory. I could not predict how time would judge me, nor did I desire to. I had sought imperfectly and with all my fallibility to serve a country that had given me everything. If my life remained a lesson for those who came after, if they learned to temper power with compassion, resolve with humility, then perhaps the price I paid had a purpose beyond my own days. They told me the nation wept. That when word spread, radios fell into silence, work stopped in factories, and men and women stood in doorways with their heads bowed. They told me the trains that carried my body through towns were met by crowds in black coats, their faces streaked with tears, their hands pressed against their hearts. I did not see these things with mortal eyes, but I felt them, as if some echo of grief carried across the veil. For years I had been their voice in the darkness, their steady presence through hardship and war, and now that voice was gone. I had given all I could. Some said too much. The burden of war, of policy, of endless nights without rest had carved away at me until there was little left. But I had never been mine alone to preserve. I belonged to the people, to the cause that had pulled me from despair and asked me to serve again and again. In that service, I found purpose beyond the confines of privilege or the prison of illness. In their faith, I discovered my strength. After my passing, Eleanor carried the torch. She moved through the world with a quiet, relentless courage, speaking of justice, of equality, of the dignity that belongs to every soul. She entered rooms where once only men spoke, and her voice carried farther than mine ever had. She helped breathe life into the institution we had only begun to dream of, the United Nations, a fragile promise that nations might resolve their quarrels not with bombs, but with words. In her, the legacy I left was not frozen in marble, but alive, growing, evolving. And the world changed, slowly, unevenly, often painfully, but it changed. The war ended, victory declared, peace celebrated with parades and confetti. Yet beneath the joy, there was mourning for the millions lost, scars etched into families and nations. Out of that grief rose a determination that it must never happen again. The charter I had spoken of was signed, the assembly convened, the dream of cooperation given a home. Whether it would endure, I could not know, but I believed it was better to try and fail than never to try at all. My story was not the story of a perfect man, far from it. I made choices that inflicted pain, signed orders that history would condemn, carried secrets that shadowed my victories. I lived with weakness and masked it with performance, asked sacrifices of others while concealing the cost of my own. Yet I never ceased to believe in the possibility of renewal, in the capacity of people, broken though they may be, to rise again. That belief was my gift, imperfect but enduring. If you remember me, do not remember only the voice from the radio, the speeches carved into history books, the smile that disguised the braces beneath my trousers. Remember instead the conviction that hope is stronger than despair, that unity is stronger than fear, and that even a man confined by illness can stand tall enough to carry a nation. Remember the truth that no leader is ever truly alone, for their strength is born of the millions who believe with them, who endure with them, who march with them into the storm. As you close your eyes tonight, as the story fades into the quiet of your own thoughts, I ask you to carry one lesson from my life, that resilience is not the absence of struggle, but the decision to face struggle with faith that tomorrow can be better. My time ended before I could see the peace fully bloom, but peace is never the gift of one man. It is the labor of generations. That labor is now yours, as it was once mine. And so I leave you with the same assurance I once gave to a nation trembling in fear. The only thing to fear is fear itself. Beyond it lies the dawn, waiting for all who dare to believe.